By October of 1976, Ratha Duong was dealing with the realities of living under the Khmer Rouge. Her mother was dead of malnutrition and starvation and illness, and her father was sick, and as a kid, she had to take care of him to keep him alive. In the communes, rice was often in short supply, sometimes due to famine, sometimes due to communist inefficiency, sometimes due to the Khmer Rouge exporting rice to China in exchange for military weapons and vehicles while their people starved to death. But anyway, Ratha Duong is taking care of her father, and she realizes that she's going to have to go on a mission of sorts to a neighboring village in order to try to get more rice to feed him. She talks about what happened on that journey, saying, quote, "I stayed overnight with my father. He told me that he had met one of his former students who worked as a rice keeper next to my community about 10 miles away. Then he fell asleep because he was exhausted. I thought of all the times my father had taken care of me when I was sick. Now it was my opportunity to get him rice from his old student. At 5 a.m, while my father still slept, I woke up and decided to go get some rice. I walked across the rice field because I didn't have a permission letter to travel. At sunset, I finally reached the community my father spoke of. I saw a light at the main kitchen. As I walked to the kitchen, I stepped on a dead palm leaf. The sound was heard by the lady who was serving rice to the Khmer Rouge soldiers. 2 men ran toward me. They arrested me and brought me to the lady, who accused me of being a thief. The 2 men tied my arms behind my back and took me to the soldiers' station. It was dark. There was no moon in the sky. I felt sad for myself that this happened. The soldiers put me in a jail that looked like a cage. I heard a girl next to my cage cry with sorrow, and I smelled the stench of blood. In the morning, I didn't see the prisoners except for the girl. I told her not to cry. We heard the mean voice of a lady. In her hand, she held a bowl of rice soup for my friend. Instead of giving it to her to eat, that witch poured the rice soup on the girl's hair. The rice soup dripped through her hair, and she tried to reach it with her tongue while the witch laughed. Then I saw the girl's body shake, her mouth open, and her eyes staring at me. She died calling my name. I cried without tears. 2 soldiers came to remove her body. Only later did I realize that this was one of my high school friends. She was the only good friend I had." End quote. Ratha ended up being released from that prison, acquiring a couple cans of rice, made it back to her village in order to feed her father and help him survive. But when she got back to the village, she found that her father was dead. This is just one example of the absolute cruelty that the Khmer Rouge imposed upon millions of people in Cambodia. And that story is not particularly, at least it doesn't seem to be particularly exaggerated or over the top in order to evoke a emotional reaction. When you decide to research the Cambodian genocide, you read story after story after story that is very similar. After all, 1.5 to 2 million people were either killed or died of illness or starvation or suffered some other horrible death. So the question becomes, what explains the cruelty? Even by the standards of genocide, what happened in Cambodia can often feel over the top. It can feel excessive in the amount of brutality and violence and terror. These are the types of questions that scholars of genocide and some of these horrible events in history are trying to grapple with so that we can understand better as a species how to avoid these types of horrible fates. Alexander Laban Hinton is a scholar of genocide and a scholar of Cambodia, and he puts forward a theory that the Khmer Rouge were able to take existing cultural models and practices and warp them in order to achieve their own violent ends. He says, quote, "In order to achieve their violent political aims, genocidal regimes will draw on pre-existing cultural models to motivate their minions to kill. This is precisely what happened during the Cambodian Genocide, as the DK regime both initiated socio-political transformations that undermined traditional constraints on violence and incorporated pre-existing cultural models into their genocidal ideology. Because these models were salient to many Cambodians, they came to serve as highly motivating behavioral templates for violence within this altered context." End quote. Hinton seems to find that ideas of face and honor and revenge, patronage, paranoia, and obedience were already embedded into the cultural so-called honor society of Cambodia, and they were invoked and twisted and warped by the Khmer Rouge. So he takes this cultural approach to maybe explain in part why some of these Khmer Rouge party members or soldiers or even ordinary people could commit horrible acts of violence. I think this may play some role, but you also have to look at some of the psychological factors underlying human behavior during these genocides. Christopher Browning, in his book Ordinary Men, pretty convincingly argues that psychological principles like obedience and conformity and the foot in the door phenomenon make it ever so slightly easier over time for ordinary people to become killers. Anonymity may also play a factor. Remember that due to the emptying of the cities and the splitting up of families and the constant shuffling of people to different communes, people didn't know each other very well. You could be someone from Phnom Penh basically on your own in a commune far in the countryside, and you may not know anybody, and some evidence may suggest that it's easier to kill someone you don't know than someone that you do know, someone that's a friend or family member, or at the least someone you recognize. When you dig into accounts of survivors of this genocide, a lot of times you see situations where they're about to be killed or they're about to be taken to be killed, and somebody recognizes them. In that account we read at the beginning of the episode, the reason Ratha is able to get the cans of rice to bring back to her dad is because her dad has that previous connection, and if she didn't have that connection and she was just stealing rice, she probably would have been killed. There does seem to be this dehumanizing effect where if you're constantly moving people around and there's no time to build personal relationships, and if the old people live in one section of the village and the new people live in another section and they eat at different times and the family unit is broken up and there's not a lot of social cohesion, then despite the communist rhetoric of a classless society, there is a hierarchy of power. And when you add in communist ideology and when you add in nationalist and racialist rhetoric that certain ethnicities or races or types of religion are lesser people, then you have this dehumanizing effect as a whole. Different scholars disagree about those underlying psychological and cultural mechanisms and how much each of those and to what extent each of those played a role in the genocide, but there's not much disagreement about the reality of genocide here. Typically, when scholars are talking about the Cambodian genocide, they're talking about the deaths of between 1.5 and 2 million people in Cambodia as a result of Khmer Rouge policy, as a result of executions and killings, as a result of mass starvation and disease, and the different ways that this affected different groups of people in Cambodia. There's a people known as the Muslim Chams in Cambodia who have ethnic heritage descended from states in Southeast Asia for years, centuries before the 20th century. But the Khmer Rouge viewed the Cham people as a people without a country. They used to have one in this state of Champa, but now they didn't. One Cham who survived what happened in Cambodia talks about the way the Khmer Rouge talked about his people, saying that the Khmer Rouge told him, quote, "Be careful or you'll end up like Champa. Now that you have come to live in Kampuchea, you must struggle hard. Do not follow the example of Champa, which did not struggle. That is why you have no country." End quote. You see this a lot in the 20th century, this idea of a people without a country, and all hard nationalists hate these type of people. To a nationalist, the highest ideal of personhood is centered on your commitment and your belonging to this group that is your nation. So when a group of people doesn't have a nation, they're viewed as weak, and they're viewed as a threat to order and cohesion. And as we've talked about earlier, the Khmer Rouge, the pillars of ideology that hold up the Khmer Rouge are communism and nationalism, two dangerous ideologies. So for the Cham people under the Khmer Rouge, it starts with early forms of discrimination, then to arrests, restrictions on rights. Eventually, the Cham language was forbidden. They were forced to raise pigs and eat pork, going against their religion. Eventually, their religion was totally abolished. They were forced to cut their hair. They were separated from other ethnicities and forced to go to their own zones and regions. And when you dive into the research, you just read story after story of people being taken away in trucks, never to be seen again, killings. I mean, Ben Kiernan goes through, in his book, The Pol Pot Regime, village after village, and he'll say, here's the population in 1975, and here's the population in 1979, and 50, 75% of people in a lot of these villages are just gone by the end of it. Ethnic Chinese were also persecuted against as a quote-unquote urban group, never given full rights, quote-unquote, due to their city status as new people and racialist undertones. Ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia received similar treatment. It was a danger to be married to someone who's Vietnamese or to have any Vietnamese relatives or really any connections at all. It was even dangerous to be Khmer but live in Vietnam. Thais, Lao, tribal minorities. The story is very similar for all of these groups: forced evacuations, executions, starvation. There was certainly a racial and ethnic component to this genocide. But it wasn't just ethnic groups who could be persecuted against. There were other categories of so-called enemies that Pol Pot was on the lookout for. In a 1976 speech, he put people on the warning for, quote, "Treacherous secret elements have been entering the party continuously. They're not gone at all. A sickness inside the party. We cannot locate it precisely. The illness must emerge to be examined. We search for the microbes within the party without success. They are buried. As our socialist revolution advances, however, seeping more strongly into every corner of the party, the army and among the people, we can locate the ugly microbes. They will be pushed out by the true nature of the socialist revolution. If we wait any longer, the microbes can do real damage. They will rot society, rot the party, and rot the army. Don't be afraid to lose 1 or 2 people of bad background. Driving out the treacherous forces will be a great victory. Everyone must be verified. The big problem is in the interior. We must resist spies along the frontier, but the important thing is to guard against them in the interior of the country." End quote. That's an important quote because, to me at least, it's pretty clear evidence that Pol Pot was directing this genocide from the top down. When you start talking about eliminating people of bad background and saying as the leader of a country that it's okay to eliminate people of bad backgrounds, furthermore, when you describe people as microbes to be washed away like you would wash your hands, killed in the same way you would kill bacteria or a virus, that's the language of genocide. The 4 years of Khmer Rouge power saw continuous purges, executions, killings, re-education, political prisons. These were common occurrences under the Khmer Rouge. Many survivors often say that the Khmer Rouge soldiers used human beings as fertilizer for coconut and banana trees, as well as the rice paddies. And whether it was cadres, party members, peasants, everybody was subject to being purged at escalating levels as this thing went on. Military officials, civilian officials, regional officials, and even ordinary peasants. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were turning over rocks looking for enemies that didn't exist. Historian Ben Kiernan describes the Khmer Rouge looking for CIA and KGB spies amongst a group of peasant farmers living in abject poverty, tilling fields, who, by the way, are there because the Khmer Rouge put them there. Kiernan describes one situation, quote, "The Svay Rieng district chief, another Southwest cadre named Hong, arrived on a motorcycle with 2 bodyguards. Hong told the crowd he was looking for CIA, KGB, and Vietnamese spies in the sub-district. 27 men, 3 women, and 2 children were called from the meeting, mostly former students, officials, and police officers. At 3 p.m., they were given a meal. 2 hours later, they were taken east to an uninhabited area, evacuated in early 1978. There, a sub-district militiaman reported later they were beaten to death with bamboo sticks and axes. The children, one of whom was 2 years old, were placed in a pig cage for the night, then killed the next day. A week later, at 4 a.m., a Southwest security squad of 15 assembled another 930 people, members of the families of people executed since 1975. At 8 o'clock, they too were given a meal, but few could eat. Aware of the fate awaiting them, many were screaming for help. Told they were going west to study in Region 24, they set out along Highway 1 at 9 a.m. 2 kilometers down the road, they were stopped at a wat and told to dig large pits. From September 16th to the 20th, all 930 were massacred there." End quote. For Pol Pot, this was a zero-sum game of power and ethnic struggle. Kill them before they kill us. As horrible as it is to say, sometimes a quick death was the best you could hope for. The political prison of Tuol Sleng is famous in world history for the cruelty and the killings that occurred there. Ben Kiernan describes one artifact that has been uncovered there that reveals what was happening in the prison. Quote, "A tiny rectangular notebook found in a house near Tuol Sleng contains 5 handwritten pages on human experiments. The notes record the results of 11 Santabal experiments with 17 prisoners, living and dead. They begin. 1. A 17-year-old girl, with her throat cut and stomach slashed, put in water from 7:55 p.m. until 9:20 a.m., when the body begins to float slowly to the top, which it reaches by 11 a.m. 2. A 17-year-old girl, badly bashed to death, then put in water as before, for the same period, but the body rises to the top at 1:17 p.m. Similar details were recorded for a big woman, stabbed in the throat, her stomach slashed and removed, and a young male bashed to death. Then, 4 young girls stabbed in the throat, and a young girl still alive, hands tied, placed in water. End quote. Ben Kiernan allows that account to just trail off because there's really no need to go on any further. Amazingly, people sometimes argue that what happened here in Cambodia wasn't a genocide, but I would challenge anyone to read those accounts and then tell me what happened here wasn't genocide. Ultimately, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were purging everybody, it seemed, looking for enemies everywhere, and this included enemies in Vietnam. As refugees are streaming over the border and military tensions are increasing between Vietnam and Cambodia, and Pol Pot is looking at Vietnamese as the enemy, and he's looking at Khmer people in Vietnam as being people that should be in his country of Cambodia, yet have questionable motivations. He starts sending raids over the border to burn Vietnamese towns and kill people, and eventually this erupts into war. So if you're keeping score at home, you now have war, starvation, disease, killing, political prisoners, the incredible amount of damage that man-made environmental experimentation is doing on the environment, whether it's animal, plant, or ecological life. You have political purges and genocides. You have misallocation of resources with the Khmer Rouge exporting rice to China in exchange for military-grade weapons that they're using to build up for this war that's coming with Vietnam. You have ordinary people just trying to survive in what is a personal tragedy of every kind. It almost seems like this whole situation almost goes beyond the realm of just a tragedy, and it feels like that's not even a descriptive enough word to describe the total nightmare at every level of society that was going on here. By the end of 1979, you have Cambodian rebels, mostly from the east, combined with refugees and base people and the Vietnamese army. About 150,000 Vietnamese troops and 15,000 rebels stream into Cambodia. The war is effectively won within days. And just like that, the Khmer Rouge were no longer in power in Cambodia. Like a black hole that collapsed in on itself, it was just a matter of time. There's only so many terrible ideas you can implement into society, only so many people you can kill, only so many aspects of society you can neglect, and wars you can provoke before society will collapse. And that's what happened for Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Sadly, the upper levels of the Cambodian Communist Party and the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot were able to escape into the jungle, where they hid out for years, creating smaller scale terror and other problems for the people of Cambodia. For many, it took years, decades, to be brought to justice by international and Cambodian courts. Members of the Khmer Rouge are still in Cambodia at high levels of government, believe it or not. Pol Pot himself died before he could be brought to justice in a court of law. And the people who survived were left to deal with the reverberations of a nightmare. The cycles of vengeance continue, the search for family and friends continue, and people trying to pick up the pieces of what happened, all of that continues right up to this day. When all was said and done, historian Ben Kiernan estimates over 1.6 million people were dead. That's 21% of the entire population of Cambodia at that time, by the way. A little bit over half of that number was new people, while the smaller half, but still a sizable chunk of dead, was base people. 36% of the Cham population, 50% of the Chinese population, 40% of the Thai population all perished, and over 1 million Khmer people, both urban and rural, perished. Which brings us to an interesting point. It's often said that with communism, the revolution will eat itself. And this is exactly what happened. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were looking for spies and traitors at every turn, and the purges and the violence destabilized society completely until the whole thing collapsed underneath its own weight. But the same logic applies to the racism and the extreme nationalism of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Racism and extreme nationalism always ends up collapsing in on itself, and ultimately it kills the people that ostensibly it is protecting. Look at those Khmer death numbers of over 1 million people who perished. That was the group that Pol Pot ostensibly was protecting. The racialism and the extreme nationalism collapsed in on itself just like it did in Bosnia during the Bosnian Genocide, just like it did in Hitler's Germany, just like it did in Mao's China. Something to think about, I think. Also worth thinking about the reality of genocide here. This was not some shapeless, formless, leaderless peasant rebellion. This was a Khmer Rouge state with total power. There was rebellion and dissent against it, but that rebellion was crushed. Historian Ben Kiernan says, quote, "Despite its underdeveloped economy, the regime probably exerted more power over its citizens than any state in world history. It controlled and directed their public and private lives more closely than government had ever done." End quote. That is a powerful statement, but it speaks to the terror that the people of Cambodia had to go through, and for those who survived, figuring out how to deal with the reverberations of a nightmare.